this analysis and what this actually means in terms of net pay towards the end of the month. So if you move on to the next slide. That's perfect, thank you. What we've done is we've created a tool that models the impact of cost of living crisis based on potential families that could feasibly be, or potential households that could feasibly be living within the borough. And what this effectively shows is, based on average households and based on sort of average professional incomes, without significant government support, albeit we await the new government's announcements on this potentially this week, the vast majority of households are going to be significantly impacted by what we're seeing across Newham. And this won't be a surprise to you, but the impact of this is effectively there'll be lots of households that don't typically engage with council services that are suddenly requiring additional support in order to cover their costs. So the first example we've got here is an example couple, so a civil servant and a marketing professional with a combined income of 67 grand. I think to anyone looking at this, that is deemed a very good household income. I think when we sort of take into account things like travel costs, they've got to get to central London in order to work, and they're renting a one-bed flat in Newham, which costs around £1,400 a month, which is the ONS estimate for a one-bed flat in Newham. But when we go through it, their sort of income left over at the end of the month is around £700. And again, whilst that might seem like a decent amount of money, I think when we're looking at disposable income, that's significantly less than it would have been this time last year. And that obviously has significant knock-on effects for businesses within the borough that rely on discretionary spend in order to sort of sustain local businesses, in order to sustain high street businesses. And that has wider economic impacts as well. So if we move on to the next case study, we've sort of modelled this for a number of households across the borough. And one thing to look at would be key workers across the borough. And the thing that we haven't talked about so far, and something that is vitally important when looking at this, is childcare. And the cost of childcare in London is very expensive, but also people that are delivering childcare need to be able to afford to live in London as well. But when we look at these two key workers, for example, who need to sort of live and work in Newham and rent a two-bed flat and with one child, very quickly we can see without any government intervention, we assume there will be some, it's getting very, very tight to be able to afford to live in Newham by the end of the month. So in terms of discretionary spend, we're down to around £68 a month. Then if the price cap rises further, and inflation rises, we're very, very quickly getting into negative territory and people falling below the poverty line. So move on to the next one, please. I think it might be the final one. We've just modelled one more example, which is around a sort of a hospitality worker. We know this is very important to Newham's economy. We know a lot of people work in hospitality across the borough, but say that person has to commute into central London. They're living in a flat share, paying around £700 a month, which is the average. Already, with the price cap at £3,500, we expect the government to freeze bills based on the previous price cap, but on the current price cap, that person is already in negative in the red, despite being in full-time work. So that's again showing that work is failing to pay. So if we move on to the next slide. I'll just pass back to Chris to sort of wrap this up.
So just to wrap up, one additional bit of analysis which isn't presented here but will be in the deck that we send on to you is around the geography as well. And we've looked at this in terms of how these scenarios play out in specific places within the borough, and that too is quite stark, and it becomes very clear that this goes from the issue of poverty being something that's quite geographically focused to being something that starts to affect the whole borough. When we start to look in on places like significant parts of West Ham and East Ham, Plaistow and Manor Park, you start to see locations where the sort of average income left over at the end of the month in summer 2021 was about £350 per month. In some locations that goes down to sort of minus numbers come the winter 2022 forecasts. So significant and stark stuff, which we can start to look at specifically by geography, which I think helps our response. Now, in terms of moving on to a response, I think although this is stark and it's quite depressing and incredibly worrying, it is important to recognise that Newham is reasonably well placed in terms of its response. Having a programme like our Newham Money, which provides debt support and income maximisation support for residents, is incredibly important, and that in itself will be a really important tool looking forward. I think also recognising that the health response in Newham around COVID-19 was nationally recognised as being best practice, and the fact that community and faith groups within Newham mobilising around mutual aid through the pandemic as well was incredibly impressive. And Newham has a diverse and resourceful population. All of these things are positives that we need to sort of keep in mind as we think about the response. From our point of view, as we thought about, how you respond, we sort of think, thinking in short, medium and long term is important. So in the short term, there is a crisis recovery. We are responding to this as if it is what it is really, which is a disaster and a crisis which needs an immediate response. But in the medium term, there are opportunities to refine policy, refine and reallocate budgets to do things differently. And then in the longer term, we have to recognise that this could be a fundamental change in the way the economy works. Susan and Simon, in the comments as we spoke, talked about work no longer paying, employment no longer being the solution. Absolutely, the way the economy works and the way the economy delivers for people will need to change, in my view. And so we as a collective need to be ready for that, and we need to plan for that as well. So thinking longer term and the type of economy, the type of place we want is important as we deal with the short-term effects as well.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just on that latter point, let's not forget that since 2019, the point at which we launched the inclusive economy, inclusive growth strategy and community wealth building, that's precisely what's anchored our approach to the local economy. But notwithstanding that, we can't control those national forces and the policy frame that is shaped by national government. I wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions that are in the chat before we go into the breakout sessions, and indeed invite anyone with any specific comments. You made reference to Susan and Susan Lucas's question alongside Councillor Simon Rush, who both point to the reality that faces many of our residents in light of the insecurity of work, and how when we're presenting the stark consequences of the cost of living crisis in Newham, how can that be weaved into the narrative and the story? So any additional thoughts outside of, well, we need to just pivot our local economy so that it works and it's fair? You're still on mute. Yeah, go on. Over to you, Chris.
So, I mean, I think, you are limited as an under-resourced local authority. You're kind of limited in what you can do through policy. I think I think the direction the council is taking in terms of community wealth building, in terms of a more inclusive economy rather than an inclusive growth approach, is the right way forward. I think thinking about an economy that works from the bottom up rather than the top down is important. So, what you have is a lot of incredibly resilient local economies, which we saw through the pandemic worked for each other. So building upon that rather than trying to encourage new external investments as the sort of driver of the economy, I think is quite important. And embracing things like circular economy principles, as I say, inclusive economy principles, more locally focused economic strategies is really important. But obviously you are limited by the resources available to you. But I think there's a number of, I think in London actually it's quite a good time for this sort of thing, because there's a lot of good progressive councils who are looking to do this sort of thing. So it might be something it will be something you have to do despite the government, I would say. But there is,
I guess it's also ensuring that we make more visible our support infrastructure, the Newham Employment Rights Hub, which provides guidance, support, and actually officer intervention if a resident operating in the insecure gig economy is being exploited. And we know through research that we've previously done that we have some 40,000 residents occupying the grey or black economy that are being exploited, being paid £2 or £3 an hour, and they largely are drawn from our communities of colour. The most, amongst the most vulnerable, and in the context of, rent increases. There was a comment here whether or not the private landlord licensing scheme could be used as an instrument to contain that. Unfortunately, it doesn't extend to rent capping. That requires legislative change at national level, and it's a lobbying ask that we've been pushing alongside the Mayor of London. You'll have noted that the First Minister of Scotland announced that there'll be a rent cap in Scotland, and she announced that yesterday as part of their response. And then there's reference to impact on younger age cohorts. Absolutely, there was research that's been undertaken by the GLA that points to a disproportionate impact on communities of colour in London, and given that 78% of our resident population are from communities of colour, even more pronounced here in Newham, but also young renters and those with disabilities. So there's quite a stark and catastrophic reality facing many households that wouldn't ordinarily think about coming to the council or accessing support from the wider partnership that we've got in place in Newham. I'm conscious of time. I can't see any hands up. People that are dropping comments in the chat, they'll be responded to. But what I'm going to suggest that we do now is that we go into breakout sessions to respond to what you've heard from Chris and Will and what's been presented via the slide deck that's been on the screen. And the breakout sessions will go on to approximately 11 o'clock, and then we'll bring everyone back together and share feedback before we go on to the next, what we're going to do about it. Okay, so who am I passing on to help with the breakout sessions?
So we're just putting people, facilitators into the rooms, and then allocating everybody to a room. It's not by particular sector or particular questions, but the facilitators will have these questions. And as they say on the side, what more can your organization do to respond to this emergency, and can we do together, and what should we be lobbying about? So I won't play any hold music or sing any hold music, but if you give us about a minute to get everybody into the rooms, you will be whisked away to have those conversations with your facilitators.
Thanks, Anne. And I'm hoping that the core questions or the asks will be visible to all the breakout groups.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
They'll be in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I can see people going. Peter, have you not got a place? You should have been invited. Anyone who's still in here who hasn't, yes. Okay, Stephen, did you get an invite to Great. Okay, so I am going to, oh, I need to be the host. Natalia, you're going to need to broadcast. Natalia, I am sending you what you need to broadcast to the breakout rooms because I can't do it because I'm not the host. Only the host can do it.
Sure, just send it over.
I'm doing it in the chat right now. Except I'm spelling it wrong.
I think Noel's room, there's 2 facilitators in as well.
Okay. Who's in there? Okay, and I'm also going to put them in, well done, Natalia. I'm also putting them in the WhatsApp chat. And I think we should stop broadcasting if we haven't.
We have.
Great.